So we are extremely fortunate tonight to have two very, very experienced lawyers here who have worked on township issues for decades. They're going to talk with us about the basics of township zoning and take questions. Einar Hanson is with Strobel and Hanson of Red Wing and regularly represents townships in southeastern Minnesota, in the southeastern Minnesota area on a wide range of issues for township governments, including land use regulation, zoning, road establishment, and road vacation. Peter Tiede, it's Tiede, right? Yeah. Is with Tiede and Grabarski of White Bear Lake. He's the attorney for a number of townships in Minnesota and has handled litigation on their behalf for many years. If you look in your packet, you'll see a fact sheet, Hometown Factory Farm Fighting, and that tells the story of New Prairie Township in Polk County. And that was in 1997. They enacted some of the first township level ordinances on large-scale feedlots. Corporate ag interests challenged the township on this, and Peter was the attorney that represented the township and won the case. I think Amanda touched on this. That case paved the way for making it clear that township zoning could be applied to large feedlots. So with that, I will hand the mic over, and thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, tonight we're here to talk about zoning. Peter and I both have had a long time representing townships on zoning issues. Let's just talk about the various reasons why you want to zone. And that's usually the sort of the entry point for townships as you start your thinking. You say to yourself, well, isn't there the county to take care of zoning? Isn't there perhaps a state on certain issues to take care of issues that you might be concerned about? The difference really is you might have a different opinion about what is sufficient governance of feedlots or other issues than the county does. The state statutes do give you separate authority to zone on your own, and it isn't really that difficult to do. There is a difference between county and township zoning, and counties, as you know, have paid staff, and township typically don't. Another thing about township zoning is that any zoning you do can only be more strict than the county. It can't be less strict. So anything you do will be because you want to be more strict than the county is, not because you want to have your zoning be less strict than the county.
You also have to be sure that what you're zoning is land use and not zoning operations of feedlots or any other kind of use. And a good example of that I think works well is to say you can have zoning ordinances say where a bank can be. That doesn't make you a bank regulator. If the town started passing regulations about bank safety and loss reserves, you'd find yourself quickly losing a court case that's beyond your zoning authority. Similarly, with feedlots and other kinds of uses, your authority is limited to land use things. How does it affect neighbors? What can they hear and feel and smell and see? And so you have to be careful that what you're getting involved in isn't environmental regulation and isn't operational regulation, like we require certain cash reserves to run your feedlot business. And so there are some lines there. And she mentioned the New Prairie case. That was basically the argument in that case against the township was you don't have authority to regulate feedlots. And the township's response was we aren't regulating feedlots, we're regulating land use. We happen to find there are things about this particular use that are incompatible with being too close to other things or being too large. Just the same way the bank shouldn't be in a place where the drive-thru is going to be a problem for the daycare center. There's going to be certain setbacks or certain size limitations on feedlots. So when you're thinking about your zoning power, you're constrained, as Einar said, by county authority, but you're also constrained by just basic zoning authority, which is land use authority, and you have to make sure that you stay within those bounds.
So for instance, you can't become the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency when it comes to the discharge of manure upon the land in your township. What you can do though is you can say that a 1,000-unit hog operation can't be within 1,000 feet of somebody's home so that the odor is not something that's injurious to them and their children in the manner in which it is operated. That type of thing is something you can't regulate. Let's get down to steps and talking about how you get started doing this. The first step, all of this we're going to talk about tonight is under Chapter 462 of the Minnesota Statutes. And there, in Appendix B is the statutes portions of that statute. Typically, the way in which people start is by passing what's known as an interim ordinance. And an interim ordinance is sometimes called a moratorium because that's what it does. It says to people who want to get building permits in your township that are within the scope of the interim ordinance, just stop a second. We got to think about and plan how we want to go forward and regulate this particular kind of use. An interim ordinance is one that can be shaped to different scopes. So for instance, if your real concern is just large-scale feedlots, if you can shape the scope of your interim ordinance, you don't have to stop all the building permits you're going to enter. If somebody wants to build a pole barn, you're not stopping them from building a pole barn. You can shape it to the kinds of things you want to be studying. So if you want to study what kind of development we want of feedlot regulation, feedlots in our township, that's what it can be shaped around. If you're worried about frac sand mining, you can shape it around that. It all is about what you want to be involved with.
When you're doing interim ordinances, you can't just be aiming at one use. That's not the proper, it didn't seem fair, it wasn't the right way to go about it.
One person,
well, yeah,
one project.
One proposed project. Yeah, one type of use is a permissible interim ordinance subject, but if you're just trying to stop a single project, and that, when people challenge interim ordinances, that's the usual argument is, hey township, you're not protecting the planning process here, you're trying to stop me thing. We use interim ordinance and moratorium sort of interchangeably because the statute or the usage is typically we want to stop something. We want to stop feedlots, we want to stop wind, we want to stop frac sand, whatever, for a while until we figure it out. And we might decide after our public process that we're good with it and we're not even going to pass an ordinance. That would be a legitimate decision. Or we're good with the county. We looked at what's going on, the county's doing a good enough job. Or we like everything the county's doing except one thing, and we're going to pass an ordinance that's a half a page long. We can talk about that option. It's to give you time to come up with that decision. And so often we call it a moratorium. The statute just talks about an interim ordinance, and I've seen it done in Olmsted County where they adopted the county's entire ordinance as an interim ordinance and just took over administration. I think that was overkill for the town I saw do it. But it opens an interesting idea to keep in your mind that a moratorium isn't necessarily the same thing as an interim ordinance. You can go more broad and you can put a scheme in place like they did. That's not usually what people are talking about when we have an agenda like tonight, but that's an option. Yeah.
So the real problem isn't passing interim ordinance in my experience. My experience is that that's a pretty perfunctory thing that can be done once your board of supervisors decides that that's what needs to be done. Whether it's for livestock or not, any public hearing is not a big deal. Just give the notice, conduct it, and pass it, certain. There's always this issue about the application coming in for a permit and whether you then are obligated to grant that application because it's done before your interim ordinance. The answer to that is no, you aren't obligated just because there's been an application made before you pass the interim ordinance to give them the permit. You can in fact stop that. The caveat on that in the statute, which has recently been amended, or fairly recently, is that you still have to deny that permit application within the 60 days that you have under the 60-day rule. As you may know, if you're familiar with townships, as many of you I'm sure are, any application, once it's complete and has been properly submitted to you, you have to act on and either approve or deny within 60 days, or it will be deemed to have been approved. So even if you pass your interim ordinance, if that application has been put in prior to you putting the interim ordinance in place, you still have to say your application has been denied within that 60-day period because of our interim ordinance that we put in place. It doesn't automatically happen.
The MPCA process and the zoning process are sort of separate.
Just think of it as two parallel tracks.
Yeah.
Don't worry about that.
Right.
EIS, EAW process over here when it comes to your zoning process over here, because they're parallel tracks, but they are separate.
And I think what's easy to not see is that the township, you're elected officials, you have zoning authority, you have statutory power to pass these laws that exist within your township. As a township lawyer, I do not concede that you are inferior to the MPCA in any way. You can say no too. If the permits were granted by the MPCA and the county, what about the town's authority, basically? And if you sit idly and don't have an ordinance, well, then you might get a feedlot. You haven't exercised any authority. But if you have exercised authority, if you have a moratorium, then they got to get through the county and the township. You can be more restrictive. You can't be less restrictive. Well, it's certainly more restrictive to say no. And you know, we're studying this, and you don't get to build until we are done studying it. And then maybe you can, and maybe you can't. But that's where we're at. And so I'm glad you got those other permits, but that doesn't really impress me very much because we've got our moratorium.
Okay.
Most counties have pretty comprehensive zoning. Of course, some have more subjects than they regulate than others, but most of them are pretty comprehensive. They cover, you know, building permits and they cover different zoning districts and all kinds of stuff, and they've got everything covered. And you can do that too. You can do what they did up in Olmsted and adopt everything the county did, or write your own regulations as long as you're consistent, and there's a whole issue with that. But you don't have to. And the statute says you can regulate basically where you want to regulate. You have to create a comprehensive plan that talks about what you want your community to be. That doesn't have to be a 50-page document that was created at enormous expense, but there has to be something that shows what you've decided your policies, and these are really policy questions. So you have to decide in your planning document, what do we want our policy to be? And if the policy is we want no feedlots or fewer feedlots or feedlots that are confined somehow, maybe your comprehensive plan is pretty simple. Maybe it says, we're good with the kind of community we have. We like the county's plan. However, we think that our township is better served by having more restrictions on certain kinds of uses. And you can pass an ordinance that's similarly brief. And this is an area that I think is really important for everybody to take this fact home. You don't have to pass the entire county ordinance. And some of the best township ordinances that I've seen and worked on have been very short, where a township will pass an ordinance that just says, for example, here's our limit on animal units, or here's our minimum setback, and it's twice as far as the county setback. Just small things like that, or you know, whatever kind of particular requirements you're going to have, again, as long as they fall within that land use, but size and setbacks certainly do. Then you're not setting up an enormous zoning scheme like the county has this great big staff to operate. You've got a ready answer for those people in your audience who say, are you going to hire a full-time zoning person and spend $250,000 a year on, you know, everybody's building permits? No, we're not doing any of that. We're passing an ordinance that covers these three items, which we as a board feel are important policy matters that we can afford to deal with, that we can manage, that we can enforce. And we're not going to care about what happens in the scenic river district that the county regulates, because we think they're doing fine over there. This is the one we're concerned about. So you have a great deal of flexibility as a township, more flexibility, I think, on a practical level than a county does, because the county, you know, they got to do it all because there's nobody else doing it all. But you've got the luxury of saying we can pick and choose what we might like to have to do better than the county. Again, you can't be less restricted. If the county says, you know, our maximum feedlot is 500 animal units, let's say, you can't say our maximum feedlot is 1,000. That's less restrictive, but you can go more restrictive. And I think that's a really important concept for towns to understand. And it takes away some of the apprehension about doing zoning, that you don't have to take on everything that the county is doing. You can pick where you can afford to be and where you care to be and where your policymakers decide it's important to be on the spectrum of zoning stuff.
So how do you get from passing your interim ordinance to the comprehensive plan? Well, this is where many of you may be serving as township supervisors, and you say to yourself, I'm already doing too much, this is already way too much work. This is where you look to forming a planning committee to help you with the comprehensive plan. You want to get people who are motivated, who are involved, who are knowledgeable about the history of your township and where it is you want to go with the township, so that they can take on part of this work. They're the ones who you want to have to get together, talk about what your vision is of the township going into the future. Now, any planning committee, planning commission, is something which is always under the care and control of the Board of Supervisors. It reports to the Board of Supervisors. But they act to try to boil down these various ideas you have, that they have, the community have, and come together. Now, oftentimes, we have found as attorneys that isn't something where really the attorneys are involved with. There's a comprehensive plan. It's more a matter of the community through the planning commission coming to that various types of decisions. And oftentimes with the help of a consultant. There are good consultants out there who, this is what they do. They help townships figure out how to put together and how to think about what they want, how they want their township to be developed. What is it they want to preserve? What is it they want to encourage? Let's say you have a major road going through your township. You know that major road is going to attract residential development, perhaps, for the next big town. You want to plan for that. It's okay that along that strip you're going to have residential development of a certain kind. That's part of the thing you think about in terms of that. You know most of your township is agriculture. You want to keep it that way. You want to figure out how it is that you're going to zone to make that possible. These are the, how can I say, ideals or the vision of your community that you need to have boiled down in your comprehensive plan. Now, why is a comprehensive plan important? It's important because it forms the bedrock upon which your zoning ordinance rests. It forms the rationale for why it is that a court should enforce your zoning ordinance instead of saying this isn't based on anything. The statute is written with the idea that the zoning ordinance is the embodiment of these ideals that you have in your comprehensive plan, your planning commission has put together, and you have come up with, or your consultant with the help of you have come up with in the past.
Typically, a comprehensive plan from a zoning ordinance or from a township will say things like, the township was formed in such and so year, we have this many residents, it's predominantly agricultural, we've got a small section over here that's got some ag service businesses like the elevator or whatever. We desire to remain agricultural, that kind of goals. And then the ordinance implements those things by saying, well, in order to make all that happen, we're going to have to stay zoned ag, aren't we, right? And we're going to have to not have a lot of subdivisions come in because that's not going to be consistent with staying agricultural. And we might need some setbacks like this because we want people to be able to do their ag but not be too close to houses. I mean, that all kind of blends in. And feedlots and other kinds of uses are traditionally some of the fights about them, and you've all heard this, and again, I try to stay out of the rights and wrongs of these things. This is all ag because look at me, I'm raising 1 million pigs and I'm providing jobs. Well, there's truth to that. No, this isn't ag. This is not the way that our community has always been. It destroys the family farm. These people don't live here. They come to the community. There's truth to that. These are policy things that your board needs to sort out. And so as you work through that process and try to enforce those policies in the ordinance, yes. Yes, guidelines for the planning commission is the question, and it's pretty open. They are governed by the open meeting law, so be careful of that. They become an official commission of the township, so you want to be sure you post their meetings and follow those rules so nobody gets in trouble. They're supposed to have at least one public hearing. Typically, they have a lot more than that. Typically, your planning commission will meet over the course of 6 months or a year, in moratorium time frame, and hold a bunch of meetings and say, we want community input, we want to hear what's going on. I encourage that, and I encourage when you're doing it, keep really good records of everything you collect and everything you look at and everything you review. If you get sued someday, every lawsuit contains within it an arbitrary and capricious argument. And the arbitrary and capricious argument basically is, town, you may have authority to do this kind of stuff you're doing, but this isn't based on anything. You're just trying to stop me. You're trying to stop this one use, or you just don't like feedlots, and you just passed a no feedlot rule. So that's arbitrary and capricious. If you have a good long process and you've kept lots of nice records of things people brought in, and somebody carried in an article about Newburgh Township, and somebody carried in an article about something else, and pro-feedlot articles too, take it all, let everybody be heard. There's nothing that goes in there that's going to hurt you. What hurts you is what you kept out, So I would encourage a very complete record. Have it be very open to the public, have as many hearings as you want, watch the open meeting law. The open meeting law says anytime a quorum is in the same place receiving information about township business, a meeting is happening. So if you got a couple of supervisors sitting out in the audience talking about your township's business, I don't think tonight counts because we're talking about the policy, laws. But if we were sitting up here talking about so-and-so's farm and how far that is from this house, and there's a quorum of your supervisors in the audience, arguably that's a meeting. So I always put in the planning commission postings that the town board may attend as well. But I think that the guideline for the planning commission is just to be really open, let everybody be heard, collect all the information they want to submit. Don't be scared if somebody's got an article that really disagrees with your point of view. That's one more thing to put in the record and show it was a fair process. You don't have to follow it. And then the planning commission eventually will make a recommendation to the town board. Here's what we've come up with, and we recommend the following policies or the following plan. Typically, by that time, the board pretty much knows what's going on. There's not a lot of discussion. They usually adopt it. They don't have to.
So, to the gentleman's question, again, one of the first things you want to do is to create some sort of deadlines by when you want to see progress from the planning commission going forward. Because remember, within this same moratorium period, at the end of it, you're going to want to have a zoning ordinance. You want to leave some time to have a zoning ordinance put together based off of the comprehensive plan. You've got 1 year, and 1 year can go by pretty quickly when you're talking about all the other things going on in your life. There's a process by which you have to follow to extend your ordinance if you don't get it all done within 1 year. So at least 2 months before that 1 year is done, you have to start thinking, are we going to get this done in time? Because if you're not, you have to start thinking about how do we get this extended and for how long can we get this extended. So working on a timetable right away that I'm going to get this done. Our planning commission, you have to come back and you have to report to us in, let's just say 6 months. So within 6 months, guys, this is what I want to hear back from you. So we have time within that time then to pass the comprehensive plan, and then we go forward and draft up our zoning ordinance that's going to be based off the comprehensive plan.
One more thought on that timing thing too, and it goes back again to the question of whether we're trying to just stop one use or doing general planning, and then this will come up a lot because there will be somebody in the audience who says, you're just doing this to stop me. I mean, that's how the conversation always unfolds. If you do pass an interim ordinance, I strongly recommend that right along with that same resolution, in the same document, you create the planning commission if you don't have one, and you order it to get started, and then that planning commission start making some paper, because if someone sues you, and this isn't just a feedlot thing, any kind of a use that you might be stopping, and whether it's gravel pits or farming corn, whatever it's going to be, somebody's not going to like it, and you have to show that you're protecting a process. And if you pass this thing and then go, oh, we took care of that, now let's go to the bar, and it's 6 months before you look at it again. In the meantime, there's no process to being protected, and somebody sues you, and you go in there and go, hey, we got this process going on. The judge says, well, exactly what process do you mean? I haven't seen you've done a darn thing except stop this guy for 6 months. You're a lot better off if you come in with a big pile of paper. And if you, in your motion, say, planning commission is created, and they're going to meet next Thursday, and here's the people on it, and their job is to get going and meet next Thursday, you've denied that person, feedlot operator or whoever it is, the opportunity to go to court the next morning and go, there's no process. What do you mean there's no process? The very second we passed the moratorium, the process started, and the meeting is on Thursday. And then at that meeting, make some minutes and collect some stuff and get some things in the pile. And I sound a little flippant about that, but if you want to be able to get in front of a judge and say, Judge, there is a process happening here. Our community is involved. The statute allows us to do this. Keep your nose out of it, with all respect, Your Honor, because this is a process that the legislature wants us to follow. You're a lot happier making those pitches when you got a big pile of paper showing a process. Here's some meeting minutes. Here's some stuff we've looked at. So-and-so is going to this seminar next Thursday to learn some more. Don't wade into this and tell us we can't have our process. The legislature told us to. So the other thing I would add, you say, what's your procedure with the planning commission? When you kick this thing off, kick it off kind of hard and get started right away so that there can never be a question about whether you really have a process, and no one can ever point to a big window of time that you didn't really do anything. The question is, what's the process for appointing your planning commission? Yeah, and is it board members or volunteer? It's all the above. It's whoever you can get. The statute allows it to be the town board. I think most people say, try to get some more people involved. First, the town board only has so much time for your princely $50 a month or whatever you're getting. And second, you get some more points of view. Often the planning commission is bigger, depending on your township, how many people you have. Generally, everybody says make it an odd number so you can't have too many tie votes. And I think that the general advice would be get people with different points of view. If you line up everybody who agrees with you, whatever your point of view is, you're going to get an answer, but it's going to be easier for it to be criticized. And also, when the process is done that way, again, depending on the community, sometimes the next election you get some kind of violent swings if people feel like they weren't heard. So the general advice is, yeah, be inclusive, get an odd number. Usually there's a board member on the planning commission. Not always, no rule says you have to be, but often people do, so there's kind of a liaison person back and forth. And then round up some volunteers, and they are appointed by the board.
And the idea behind it is that you first have this bedrock of ideals you're trying to promote through your zoning ordinance. And that's the whole purpose, and that's the whole reason why you get to do zoning. So the comprehensive plan forms this bedrock upon which your zoning ordinance is then built on top. You have to think of it like that. When it gets around to the zoning ordinance, that's probably when, unfortunately, you have to get the attorneys involved, because that's when you go to them and say, these are the types of things we want to implement. And then Peter and I and other attorneys see ourselves as people who are trying to help you implement that through the zoning ordinance, which is what the next step of that would be.
most of the attorneys around the state who do township work all kind of know each other, and we all share documents with each other. So you shouldn't have to work really hard to come up with, and you've got good examples in the book here too. With a little bit of scratching the surface, you should come up with a number of good examples. That'll help you not miss the boilerplate, but it also gives you ideas. You might look at that and say, oh wow, here's another way we could go about this, and that's a helpful thing for us to think about. Maybe depth of lagoons or whatever it's going to be might be an area that you hadn't contemplated that someone else looked at. So as you go through that process, Einer's right, when you get to the drafting, you probably should have a lawyer involved. We both recommend until that point, other than consultation, you probably don't need much lawyer involvement. You're better off
Once you get
with
past the interim ordinance stage.
Yeah, typically the lawyer's involved in the interim ordinance, get that up and running. Then typically the lawyer backs out other than some amount of talking where you work with the consultant, and at least I think most consultants are going to be better for you than I would be. They'll do a better job and they'll be cheaper. We tend to kind of bump into the process a bit with them. We answer questions, we talk about policy, maybe we come to a meeting, but primarily that's the consultant. Then when you get to ordinance time, then the lawyer generally comes back in and gets involved in the actual writing and the formalities of getting it adopted.
One of the things which people oftentimes find scary about the idea of passing a zoning ordinance is the thought that you're going to have to hire somebody to implement that. You don't. That is something that simply can be done through your existing staff, the township supervisors, and the treasurer and the town clerk. You don't have to have a zoning administrator. Sometimes you do have a zoning administrator, especially in the more populated townships, but that hasn't really been my experience of it being done. Typically, it's a matter of once your zoning ordinance is in place, there's probably an application process for permits for you to have that implemented by your attorney in a way in which the procedure is understandable to people who are going to be using it. And it's a matter of you taking that on as another piece of business during your township meeting. And it's going to be another piece of business during every township meeting. But it's not an overwhelming process. And it's something where I think any and all of you can handle, especially with the help of an attorney that you have at the end of the line who can answer questions for you. Well, what is the application of this ordinance in this particular situation? Because there's always new situations that you aren't going to have seen before, and you don't really know quite how that fits into this particular barrel. The question is, if in fact you don't have a zoning administrator, and someone who should have applied for a permit to do something does it anyway without a permit, then you do an enforcement process. You actually get an attorney involved, and you hire them to enforce that against the person who's violating your zoning ordinance, and require them to seize that, perhaps tear it down, as it may be, whatever they're doing without the ordinance approval.
And that too, you can also enforce criminally. It doesn't change what you do a whole lot, but it sometimes gets their attention a little bit more. It is a criminal violation to violate your zoning ordinance. And I've been involved in a couple where we actually got people convicted and put them on probation until they quit doing it. That tends to get people's attention. But when someone comes along who's flagrant, you better be ready at that point. Otherwise, you haven't spent your time wisely because you're not really going to enforce it anyway. Most people will follow it, but every now and then somebody's not going to. And if the word gets out that you don't plan to follow your own ordinance, then it's sort of useless at that point. As you're at the point of, kind of where we're at, where we're talking about, we're setting some policies, we're thinking about an ordinance, what happens with the county, that's a really good time to be talking to the county. And legally you don't have to. Legally you can do whatever you want, but practically speaking, you got to work with these people. But at this point, just politically, be talking to the county, figure out what reaction you're going to get, see if they're going to work with you, see how much of it they might be willing to do. They might even say, hey, we'll mend our wicked ways and do what we haven't been doing, and if you won't pass your ordinances. They might work with you, they might be very hostile to you. Just depends on a lot of things, but you'll want to know that as your town board gets around to thinking about what to do. Whether you like it or not, you're partners with the county in this process, and you may as well know what you're signing up for with them.
Could you talk a little bit about various expenses that are associated with different aspects of this process?
Yep. Now, the question is, can we talk about what the costs are for doing this kind of thing? And there's a lot of variety to that. If you're talking about doing just a small amount of ordinancing, we're just going to change setbacks or something, your process costs will be in the $2,000 range. Your lawyer fees are going to be in that range or less, maybe more if you have someone come to a meeting or two. The whole thing is going to be in that handfuls of thousands of dollars to put it in place. if you decide we're really going to go for it and do much more comprehensive zoning, it's going to cost a lot more. You're going to have a consultant come to a lot of meetings. Sometimes those consultants have a flat fee of $5,000 or $10,000 to take you through the process. Just depends on who you get and what you do. The lawyer fees will be higher as well, because if you send me a document that thick to read, it costs more than one that thick. That's just how that is. And it tends to kind of grow exponentially because of the interplay of all the provisions in there. Also, as you write a longer and longer document, ensuring consistency with the county ordinance gets more and more complicated. It's really easy to see if your setback is farther, but when you've got 75 pages, that's a lot more work. So the fancier you get, the more it's going to cost. And then again, the other place to just be realistic about is if you do have to do an enforcement, that's going to cost money, and that one's a little harder to control because it depends how much of a fight they put up. You may have, and I don't know I always shy away from answering this. If you get sued first, it may trigger your insurance if you have liability insurance through MSI or the Township Association or the League of Cities or whatever your organization is. But I'm not in a position to promise you coverage on anything. You'd have to check your policies. But affirmative actions you bring to go enforcing will not be covered. Yeah, this is a real budget item, at least to get started. And then once it's running, it typically doesn't cost you much at all to run it. But then you just have to be ready that if you ever had to do an enforcement. Oh, that's a good question. Can you get your attorney's fees if you win in court? There is a statute that says the cost of prosecution can be added to your enforcement. I've never seen anybody get you money for that, don't you, Ryan? It just doesn't work.
I have done it once.
You got money?
I got my money.
Oh, well, then you better hire Ryan. If someone does that, if someone says, I'm just not gonna, so too bad, well, you better be ready to go after them. And it doesn't have to cost millions of dollars, but it's going to cost you, some thousands, and it's going to cost that money kind of right now because you got to get going. And if not, then I think you got to think about how serious are we, because you're doing all this so that you have the power to do that. And if you're not going to do that, then.
And in the end, you're fronting the money in any event, because you're only going to collect that money from the other side after you sued them, after you've gotten a judgment, after you already have spent all your money on your attorney who's gone and done the work to that point in time. So you're still going to need to understand this is going to have to be part of your budget to do on a front end type basis. So one thing I've done in a couple townships is at the annual meeting, I have asked the electors to give the power to the township to charge the violator the attorney's fees for enforcing the zoning ordinance. And I've used that. That was the time that I got the attorney's fees, was using that kind of elector power given at the annual meeting to get attorney's fees. So essentially passing our own little law within the township that if you violate, you're going to have to pay the township's attorney's fees to enforce the law. I haven't gotten a challenge on that in district court or appellate court at that yet. And it works in this one situation. So it's something you have to think about as a possibility of putting in your ordinance as a way of making it that much more scary for people when you say, I'm not only going to enforce this zoning ordinance against you, but you're going to get this great big bill because of the attorney's fees that we're going to have to run up to enforce it against you.
The question is it better budget-wise to...
Does a stitch in time actually save none?
Yeah. To start now, before there's an applicant at the door and get the ordinances in place you want, or does it make sense to wait till one shows up? I suppose to answer the numeric question, you probably don't know. I think as a policy matter, if you feel it's important to regulate solar or gravel pits or feedlots or something, I'd say get started before someone comes to the door, because then you don't have that same kind of time pressure. You don't have that person saying you're doing this just to stop me. You don't have all the neighbors dealing with this one person.
Yeah, and in the end, you're building expectations. I mean, if a person has expectations on what they're going to be able to do with their land and what kind of economic development they're going to be able to do, if they don't have that expectation because you've already passed the zoning ordinance saying that's not going to be allowed in our township, they don't have the same sort of feeling of having something stolen from them that happens if you're doing it after they've done all the planning, after they got the financing set up, after the plans are in place. So doing it early takes away that whole emotional engine that will cause you to get sued.
The point here is, with various kinds of uses, to consider the interim use power as opposed to a conditional use power.
Definition.
Yeah, the interim use is like a conditional use, but it can be terminated by changing the ordinance or by the passage of time, whereas a conditional use is a right that runs with the land as long as you're in compliance with it and you can sell it, whatever. And so depending on the kind of use and the kind of capital investment somebody's going to make, an interim use can be a lot nicer from the town's point of view because you can get rid of it if you need to.
There's a lot more nuance.
Yeah.
You can shape it more.
Yeah. There is an argument under the interview statute that they're supposed to agree to whatever your conditions are. I've never seen that tested in court, but it reads a little bit differently if you actually put them side by side. But yeah, the interviews is a really good tool, and I think that's an excellent point. If you're thinking about, my idea of the very simplest ordinance is one that says, here's our setback, here's our maximum limits. There's no real permits to that. Just if you're going to have whatever it is, here's your setback, here's your limits, and it's permitted within those requirements. But if you're going to grant permits, for sure take a look at whether the kind of use you're talking about is better interim or conditional. The question is, what if you get the county to do it for you, basically, if they'll implement the policies you're interested in? That kind of goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago about involve the county in your process, and you may involve them only to find out that they're not going to be helpful to you, but they might respond by saying, hey, if what you guys are really looking for is better setbacks and this and that, well, we can probably accommodate that. That's a great result. You don't pay a bunch of attorney's fees. If somebody gets sued, it's them and not you. That's wonderful if you get what you want from it. The only reason to do your own process is if you're not getting what you want that way. But yeah, if you can talk them into doing it for you, that's really cool. And sometimes they will, because again, sometimes they'll say, hey, our job is to serve you, or we get defensive that you don't think we're doing a good job, so we'll change it to make you not do this. But either way, it might get you what you want.
Well, just to follow a little further, you might still find yourself, though, thinking about an interim ordinance to buy yourself the time to essentially negotiate with the county for them to take on this process, because you're still going to want to buy that time within which that type of development you see coming isn't going to be able to do the camel's nose under the tent type of thing.
And at its core, that's really township government. You've got an annual meeting that sets some parameters for how this thing's going to work, and then you've got a few people who are elected to implement that during the year. That's the basic township government. Now, then what's happened over the last 50 years is a lot of city powers have been grafted onto that. The zoning authority under 462, it's the same statute Minneapolis uses. Towns were added to that, and towns have been added to a lot of things, and then urban towns were created. But the core of a township works kind of like, Pa and the guys getting together to figure out who's going to gravel the roads. The question is, do the township supervisors have to accept the planning commission? No, they don't. It's only recommendatory, advisory. If they're going to go in a different direction, that's a good time to talk to the lawyer, because if you've built up a big record that supports going this way, and then you go that way, you want to be careful about somebody saying that's arbitrary and capricious. But no, the planning commission is only advisory except in very narrow circumstances, and in this circumstance, it's very clear that they're only advisory.
The question was, can townships work together? Can we essentially share costs? Could these 4 townships all decide we're going to share the cost of the attorney and the cost of the consulting and do that kind of thing together? Yes, you certainly can. As Peter was referencing, these 13 townships up by Rochester, they've gone into a more formal relationship of sharing those costs with the zoning administrator. But there's no reason you can't do that and talk to your fellow townships who are interested in doing the same type of process.
Yeah, the question is, who's working with the county perhaps better? Yeah, if you have a good working relationship with the county, that can be a tremendous advantage, because they do have qualified staff. They're good at figuring all this stuff out. If they want to be supported, they can make this really easy for you. Or again, sometimes, as the gentleman over here said, sometimes they'll just do it for you. That's wonderful, and that's really an interesting political question. One of the things that's fun about this work is the variety of interplays between towns and counties. And some counties are wonderful to work with, and again, without sounding too casual about it, some counties are very hostile to it, and I don't know what you'll run into, but that's why I think starting early and starting cooperatively is better than dropping the bomb on them later, because they won't like that.
So what are the major steps for getting a zoning ordinance in place? I think is what the question is being asked. Major steps are really basically a 3-step process. Step number 1 is passing your interim ordinance. And that is to essentially create space for you to be able to think about what your vision of the township is. As part of that, you are appointing your planning commission, or having your board act as a planning commission, setting up a timetable as part of that interim ordinance, or very shortly thereafter, for that to work toward your comprehensive plan. That's step number 2, is comprehensive plan. That's the bedrock that you're building, that's your vision for the township. And step number 3 is getting your ordinance itself drafted and passed. And all of these are going to be things which you're going to have public hearings about, both for comprehensive plan and for passing your ordinance. So you're going to want to think of those 3-step process: interim ordinance, comprehensive plan. Interim ordinance stops the process, gives you time. comprehensive plan gives you that bedrock you're building on. The zoning ordinance is actually the implementation of what it is you want to do. The question is, we have a township that is thinking about putting into play an ordinance. What about uses that we wish to essentially have continue? In zoning parlance, those are called non-conforming uses, or sometimes they're called uses that are grandfathered in. And the manner in which you grandfather in or you do the non-conforming use is something you take care of in the way in which your zoning ordinance is drafted. So you'll have a provision in your zoning ordinance that will allow for non-conforming uses, and it'll state the conditions under which those non-conforming uses have to be weeded out. So the idea is that you give time, but then eventually, or maybe not, maybe those continue forever, maybe at some point in time they get weeded out, but you can start that process with your comprehensive plan. You can say, we want to allow existing uses to continue in your comprehensive plan. Your zoning ordinance will implement that desire through giving an exact procedure and conditions for which those will continue. So for instance, if you have an existing slaughterhouse in your township, and you don't want to put this particular guy who's lived there forever out of business, but you know, at some point in time, that should cease. And you know he's 85, right? The idea is that that use can continue up until such time as ownership changes hands in that business or something of that nature.